Hey everybody, welcome back to building a wooden coaster for Uzuri Gardens. Now I know you've probably looked at the length of this video and you're very much afraid of what's gonna happen here, why this is more than half an hour long. And first of all, I have to say I already cut out a lot of footage from this just to make this video shorter. I said I would make this a two-part video, so it's 2 parts, but really I could have filled a bunch of episodes with the amount of footage that I had, so I had to cut out some of the most boring parts, but at the same time, okay, maybe I'm just so evil, but at the same time I want to keep most of the footage here and show most of the support work, which ends up being a very time-consuming activity, as you might think. That said, there is light at the end of the tunnel. I will give some cinematic shots of the coaster and a POV at the end of this video, so you can either stay here for the full half an hour that I'm gonna try and commentate through this, or, you know, just skip forward to the cinematic parts if you're interested in that. Should be somewhere around just after the 30-minute mark. But for the rest of us who are staying behind here, I have to admit this is as much a very difficult journey for you as it is for me. I know this is a very long video and I literally didn't know what I would even do with this video, because normally I have a lot of things to talk about, or at least I can come up with things to talk about in my videos. What I tend to do is I just watch back generally what the time-lapse is about, get a notepad file and get some things that I want to talk about and just kind of go from there and see wherever my stream of consciousness takes me. But in this case, this really is 30 minutes of just building wooden supports mostly, so nothing really changes and there's not a lot that I can say directly relating to what's going to be happening on the screen. So I've got a good list of topics that I want to talk about with you guys, and we'll see how I make my way through that list. For now though, just as a very quick introduction as to what I'm actually doing in this episode. So you just saw me finish off the last part of the layout. This was a pretty simple part, just some curves very low to the ground to finish it up, because there's not a lot of speed left, but I still wanted to maintain that feeling that you get on so many GCI coasters, where it really feels like the coaster doesn't slow down all the way until you're in the brake run, which is really cool. So I'm keeping some of the last parts of the layout very close to the ground, just to make sure that I'm making the most out of my speed. And at this point I started work on what is probably the most important and most annoying thing out of this whole project, which is supporting this turnaround element here, which is also kind of my favorite. At the same time, I really have very mixed feelings about this, because at once it was definitely the most difficult part of the support work to get done, but on the other hand, I think it's also one of the best parts of what I managed to get done here, and probably also one of the most iconic ones. Jonty said that he wanted a big mess of wooden supports like you would see on many GCI coasters in real life, with those diagonal beams slanting out from the track, and with all of the beams in between as well that are so dense that you sometimes can't even see through the supports, and that is mostly what's going to be happening on this section of the track. For the most part also because this is the only part of the track where the coaster is quite high off the ground for a long amount of time, because for most of the rest of the layouts it's all very close to the ground, which, like I said, is partly because I want to maintain a sensation of speed throughout the entire layout, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that I was also kind of happy to try to avoid having too much support work here. But yeah, this turn here is gonna be quite iconic, I suppose, because it has those very typical GCI supports on the sides with all the diagonal beams, which is gonna take quite some time to do, because like I kind of explained in the last episode, we have the beams which are parallel to the track, or well, really 90 degrees from the track, going from the catwalk to the ground, and then in between that are the horizontal beams, and in between that I put the sort of diagonal cross-hatching beams there, and finally connecting the horizontal beams and the diagonal beams are also going to be vertical beams going back to the ground, and then all of those beams are going to need footers when they reach the ground. And I do have to say, before anyone mentions this, that this is one of the things where this coaster is kind of unrealistic. There are a few things that I should mention that are a bit off about this coaster, and one of them is that the footers are square. And in real life, GCIs have circular footers, and there are actually good pieces for this. I remember finding one of the pillar pieces in the scenery tab is actually quite good at this. But the problem was that I started off with the square ones, just imitating the in-game ones, and halfway through the process of adding footers to the coaster, I also don't want to remove all of the old footers or put new round ones over them, so I'm just gonna keep them like they are. Not to mention that if I were to replace them with circular ones, I'd not just have to replace them on the custom supports that I built, but really realistically also on the in-game supports, which would be a monumental task. That's not to say that this whole project in general isn't a monumental task, but at the end, at some point, I need to give this file back to Masked Bandit and Geekism as well, because, you know, they're gonna want to work on this at last, and I've been stalling on their project for long enough, I think. So that is one of the less realistic things about this coaster. Another one that I'd want to give a quick shout is somebody commented on the last video that apparently many GCI coasters have one section of their supports where they just put decorative wooden planks, and he gave one example. To be honest, I've never seen this before, but it actually looked kind of cool, but I didn't end up doing it because I sort of forgot about it, and then when I was almost at the end of this, I decided to not record my supporting anymore anyway, because I already had way too much footage and I just wanted to round off everything. So I didn't end up doing that, so that was just a small finishing touch that I have to say I'm sorry for not deciding to add that. I hope you understand that I was very done with all of these wooden pieces by the time I got done with supporting this. Do I sound salty at all? Again, I do have to say that I'm really happy with the result, but the process of this is definitely quite draining. And here I also have to say that I'm really glad that this was a collab actually, and that Masked Bandit and Geekism asked me to do this, because doing it for somebody else is a good motivational push to actually go forth and finish the support work. Because if this was my own thing, I would have probably supported one curve and then realized that I would not enjoy doing the rest. So having that extra motivation to actually do it because it's a collab was really nice. So I'd like to thank you guys for that as well. And this one's for Masked Bandit and Geekism, of course. God. How far am I? Oh, we're almost at 10 minutes. That's not too bad. I still have a bunch of stuff that I need to talk about. So for one, the coaster actually has a name now. I didn't talk about that in the last video just because there wasn't a name. But we've settled on the name Silverback, which should fit the African theme of the park quite well. Most of the areas and buildings, etc. in the park have Swahili words so far, and we did come up with a Swahili name for this coaster, which was something for typhoon. I forgot the exact name, but Silverback just fit the coaster really well. It fits the zoo theme of the park, and something which I didn't realize until Masked Bandit and Geekism pointed it out to me is that, of course, Silverback is kind of similar to Silvarret, so it's a small reference to my name as well. So yeah, I think it's a fitting name for the coaster. I guess it's also one that's easy to pronounce, because as much as the Swahili name ideas were really cool, in a sense I guess you do need some kind of international marketability when it comes to a flagship attraction ride like this. So I can kind of see why they didn't go the way of the Efteling and make their main coaster super unpronounceable. So yeah, that's that. Now I also want to talk about this coaster that I made about 2 years ago, that I quickly name dropped in the last episode, I think, called Gambit. This was my first try at making a GCI coaster in Planet Coaster, and it was also my last one until this one. I think Gambit was actually better than this coaster, but about all of the time that I spent into making supports for this coaster, I spent on making just the layout for Gambit alone, let alone supports. So even though I think the end result was slightly better than this, the amount of time that I had to put into it was significantly much more. So I think in the end I made a good decision to try and keep this coaster, you know, somewhat restricted in terms of how far I would go with experimenting with the track. I made gambits using the 4-meter method, which meant that, especially for a GCI coaster like this, I had to pay very close attention to which parts of the track I would smooth out and which I didn't, because normally when you use the 4-meter method you just kind of smooth out everything and eventually the track becomes smooth enough. But in the case of Gambit, I also wanted to preserve the typical snappy transitions of GCI coasters and the quick pops of airtime that you have everywhere. So the smoothing had to be pretty precise everywhere, so that made the already time-consuming 4-meter method even more time-consuming. And then there's just the fact that it's the 4-meter method as well, which is quite annoying. And the very idea of Gambit as a terrain-conforming GCI coaster was born from the fact that I wanted to build a GCI coaster in Planet Coaster, but it was really hard to do it on the flat land because at the time we didn't have the friction sliders yet, and for some reason the GCI coaster in the game had way too much friction on it. So Gambit is built into the hill just to maintain a good speed throughout the entire layout, while at the same time still having that very high friction that the game gives you. So really, it's not even a very realistic layout. Realistically, in real life it would be way too fast. I just kind of made it to overcome the limitations of Planet Coaster at the time. And the problem was that very shortly after I finished the layout for Gambit and uploaded the video, a friction slider was added to Planet Coaster. Which is not a problem per se. I'm actually really happy that this was added. And it basically allows us to make realistic coasters nowadays, or realistic wooden coasters, because most of the friction settings were pretty much good. So really, without the friction slider, I wouldn't be building this wooden coaster right here, right now. So definitely don't want to throw any shade on that one. But I was feeling a little bit demotivated about Gambit, because I went out of my way to overcome a limitation that was quickly solved thereafter. So that was a bit awkward. But I do have to say, Gambit might, and I need to say might with a capital M here, and actually, no, capital all letters, just make them all caps and bold. Maybe Gambit is gonna return someday, a very slight possibility, because I gave the file over to Joshua, who I've known for a while, mostly due to his Fury 325 recreation, which is probably the best recreation of any coaster that I've ever seen in Planet Coaster, and it's not even completely finished. It's insanely accurate, and while I know that he isn't quite that well known, especially if you're just on YouTube and not in some of the deeper reaches of the Planet Coaster community on some discords, like the Bro Nation Discord for instance, but his Fury 325 recreation is absolutely amazing. And he just goes above and beyond to try and make things realistic. So he just sent me a message on Discord asking if he could have the file. And given his track record, no pun intended, I figured I could just hand it over to him and see if he was able to do anything with it. So he's currently working on some of the supports, I believe, and reworking some of the parts of the layout as well. So together with him and also the work that Free the Bear did earlier on the supports, maybe Gambit is gonna return one day, albeit with a lot of help from other people. So I should really not give myself any credit for this. It just seems like there's been a lot of renewed interest in GCI coasters in Planet Coaster since I released the last video, which is absolutely amazing to see. I saw so many pictures of people currently making GCI coasters or going back to some of the GCI coasters that they tried building earlier, and it's just always really interesting to see, because this is one of those things that's really, you know, limited to the most crazy, insane coaster enthusiasts, because most people, you know, wouldn't care too much about any particular company of wooden coaster per se. A wooden coaster is more or less a wooden coaster to the layman, but in the case of GCI and coaster enthusiasts, it's just such a tiny niche interest that so many people are just so invested in and try their best to try and make something as close as possible to whatever this specific company puts out. It's just really interesting, and for somebody who's as into the nerdy side of coasters as I am, it's just really cool to see. So yeah, that's been awesome. I'm really happy actually in general with all of the support that the first video had been given, so honestly, thank you guys for that. I really didn't expect it to, be this well received. I thought people would just get kind of bored by me placing wooden posts for an extended amount of time. But the reception on that video was way better than anything I ever expected, so thank you guys for that. That's amazing. Do I have anything else that I want to talk about? We've about hit the halfway mark, and a lot of supports have been done already. I'm getting now to this point, which I'm not sure, if it was a good idea to actually add custom supports here, because maybe Masked Bandit and Geekism are going to mess with this area a bit. But it's going to be tricky, because the track that we have running up here, just above the station, is going to be the station flyby, or it's just going to fly just past the station building. But in any case, it's that typical GCI element where halfway through the layout you just fly by the station in a straight piece of track. It gives you a bit of a breather as well, for just 1 second before you go back into the madness. But I did decide to kind of custom support this for a bit, but the supports don't actually make that much sense, I have to admit, and the fact that there are supports at all in this sense might not make that much sense either, because if this were really a station flyby, you'd have some kind of other support structure related to the station building, which I'm not building, so that's not something that I can incorporate here. So yeah, I'm not too sure what exactly to do with that. I just put some quick posts in there for now to make it look a bit better, but the rest is going to be up to Masked Bandit and Geekism there to see what they can do with it. And I'm also extending the steel supports of the lift hill, just because there was a bit of a tight situation down there, and I thought, might as well connect these steel supports and make the entire lift hill structure based on steel supports. But yeah, also another problem that I'm not gonna have to deal with anymore, but that I'm definitely leaving behind, is the idea of what to do with the queue. I put the queue, or really the entrance building to the station, at the back of the station right now, and it's gonna have to go over and under some parts of the wooden coaster track. I have no idea how that's gonna work. Yeah, I think Masked Bandit is trying to figure that out right now, but actually looking back at my Discord messages, they've been sending messages back and forth of what to do with the queue. I'm sorry about this one, guys, but yeah, I basically just left a giant puzzle behind for whatever the queue is gonna have to be like. But the rest of this area is quite well defined, I think. There's the access road allowing trucks and all kinds of services to enter the park, and there's an open plaza right in front of the station with that large stretched out airtime hill going over it, which is all going to be pretty much incorporated into the park layout designs, which the others are going to come up with. I also have to say, this coaster does feature some straight sections, which is a little bit unusual for GCI coasters. Typically they just go from curve to curve to curve without straight airtime hills, for instance, which is the complete opposite of traditional wooden coasters, which are mostly just straight airtime hills. So the fact that this coaster has a straight airtime hill just after the first drop is a bit unusual, but at the same time I thought it worked really well with the layout of this coaster. The idea is that you have the main entrance to this coaster, the big plaza that leads to the area of this coaster. It's gonna have that straight airtime hill going straight over that plaza, with some kind of sign of the coaster, some kind of logo right in front of it. So I think it should be a very interesting way to enter this area, and almost like a weenie to drag people into going into the coaster. So I think that makes more sense from a park layout perspective than a coaster layout perspective, even if you're probably gonna get some really good floater airtime on that airtime hill. I actually barely checked the G-forces on this coaster, but from what it looks like, I can tell that it's going to be some decently strong airtime. although not too strong. Typically GCI coasters don't have a real strong, like beyond -1 vertical G-force airtime, so that's also something to take note of, I think. You know what else I haven't talked about? That's actually a really interesting fact about GCI coasters, and actually I don't know if other wooden coasters do this, or which manufacturer specifically, or which coaster type specifically, but GCI always does this, is they have slightly banked brake runs, and you rarely see anybody actually do this, but in real life their brake runs are typically just a little bit banked, so you're not entirely straight on the brakes, just because they need the fins to brake the coaster to fall into the slots of the brakes. So I don't know, I always thought that was really interesting, because I always imagined that brake runs are completely straight, but not only do they typically go down a little bit, because straight coaster track won't allow the coaster to coast if, you know, any of the drive tires, for instance, are down, but the track is also slightly banked, so you're kind of tilted on your side on the brake runs as well. And I don't know, I always thought that was very interesting, and it's hardly noticeable. Maybe if you know about it and you pay really close attention to it, you can notice it, but if you don't know about it, you're probably never gonna be able to pick up on it. But I've seen some coasters in Planet Coaster which actually go out of their way to add a banked brake run, and it's just one of those little nerdy elements where it's like, ah, I see what you did there, and most people would probably not recognize it. Or maybe they will after this video, if this video blows up enough, but you know, it probably won't. But yeah, here you go. Just a little neat fact to know about as I try to make my way through the list of things that I want to talk about to fill my time here. And I'm adding still supports to that whole structure of that curve, and you can actually notice that most of my time of building supports is that one curve. I do have to say that some of the footage that I cut out was from the other turns and the more close to the ground areas, which are all more or less the same, and I didn't take out any footage for the large curve. Now this is actually kind of interesting. I'm adding some planks in the middle of the rails, and this is something which will typically be used whenever the coaster goes from one side to the other in terms of banking. So whenever it goes from a curve to the left into a curve to the right, and the catwalks move from the left to the right, or the other way around, there'll be some planks in the middle of the rails so that you can walk from one side of the rails to the other one. So I won't be placing too many of these. It really just depends where all of the transitions between the curves are. But this is something that you'll notice if you watch on-ride videos of wooden coasters in real life, or if you ever ride a GCI yourself. You'll notice that whenever you're going from a back curve to the left, to the right, you'll see some wooden planks on the middle of the track, which are just there for evacuation purposes. But it's one of those little touches that are just something neat and something simple to add for a little bit of extra realism. I do have to say, these planks don't actually fit as well as they could have. In hindsight, it would have probably been better to use the 2-meter posts and then just use 2 of them in a row. But I think the planks are alright enough, so I let them stay after I figured it would take a lot of time to remove these and put something else in. For now, I wanted to put my attention towards something else. We are in a zoo, of course, so I wanted to have this coaster to be a little bit quiet and not wake up all of the animals. Just in general, it's pretty terrible if you're running loud roller coasters in a zoo. So it's something that I noticed Gold Striker does in California's Great America, which has residential areas around the theme park, is to put styrofoam plates underneath the track to block off the sound, because, well, wooden coaster tracks are quite open, so if you don't have these, then all of the sound is just going to travel straight through the track, especially on sections like this where the track is very heavily banked. So they use these styrofoam boards to prevent the sound from traveling there as much as they can, which is something that I actually never really thought about before. But if you watch a POV of Gold Striker, you'll see that you have, you know, some white stuff underneath the track, and it's one of those things that I always noticed but never really gave a second thought. But when I was looking up how to, cancel noise on wooden roller coasters, because I was specifically looking for ways to do that for the zoo here, I found out that this is apparently how Gold Striker does it. So that's really interesting, and the way to add these into the track is also kind of simple. Just snap to whatever you can, which is in this case the rails, and sink them into the rails a little bit. Sometimes you need to adjust them a bit, but for the most part, it's just letting them angle snap to the rails and dragging them underneath the rails a little bit. And also, yeah, I'm just using the arch shapes for this because they're just about the right size and shape. Maybe not the best texture, but I think they work well enough. Now this is also quite interesting because the styrofoam alone isn't going to block off the sound of the wooden coaster enough, I thought. So just like Gold Striker, I also want to install some fences on the curves. Although thankfully, unlike Gold Striker, we're not completely surrounded by areas that we can't let any sound into. So in my case, it's going to be just this curve and just the upper part here where I also want to add fences. Because there's the crocodile area very close by. I asked Masked if they were crocodiles or alligators, but apparently he didn't know either, so I'm just gonna assume that they're crocodiles. I have to be completely honest, this is one of these things that I always forget the difference, and I always have to look it up again, and I'm not even gonna bother this time because I'm just gonna forget it anyway. But yeah, there are some animals nearby on this side of the track, so that's why I'm installing fences specifically on this side, but not anywhere else on the layout of the coaster. And the styrofoam, pretty much, yeah, the same goes for that one. Although I also had some styrofoam on the lower parts of the layout here, just because I want to make sure that the coaster is as quiet as possible on this side. And I had to make all of these fences custom with blanks as well, because obviously the in-game fences, while they do look really nice, they don't quite follow the shape of the rails the same way. So I had to do it this way, but I think it works out alright. And then finally there are some wooden beams on top of the track here, which I have no idea why exactly they are like this, because they are shaped as though it were a tunnel, but there's really only fences on one side of it. But Gold Striker does this as well, so I figured, might as well. I'm not entirely sure what the purpose is, but it looks alright, so I just added that in there. And here's another smaller detail which is also interesting and quite important to add everywhere, which is iron girders whenever the track is crossing itself. So obviously wood isn't the strongest of materials, even though it is pretty strong, but usually whenever the wooden supports need to cover a bigger distance, like when one part of the track is diving underneath another one, metal girders are used to hold up the rest of the track. So I'm just installing these at all of the crossroads of the different coaster tracks. So that should more or less work to hold up everything. And there's not too much that I need to do here in terms of custom supporting. I'm just trying to make these things fit as much as possible the in-game supports. Now at this point I also realized that Masked Bandit and Geekism didn't want to build on this side of the road at all. So I pretty much had to finish my supports here and remove the path that I had for the longest time on this side, because I was thinking of some kind of pedestrian bridge going over the access road and integrating in some kind of large themed area here. But apparently we don't really need to go in that direction, so I needed to finish some of the supports on the side here, and that will be it. The rest of the theming and how the access road is going to be hidden, if at all, isn't up to me to decide. I'll just leave that up to the other guys. But yeah, I'm just finishing up as much as I can the different supports here, so that whatever the case, and whenever they still need to theme and add to this ride, which is still very unfinished, they don't have to come back and do this whole supporting job, because God knows that it's quite a tough job to do. As far as doing stuff in Planet Coaster goes, you know, it's still a game in the end, but if there were any dirty jobs within this little microcosm of gameplay thing, I think making wooden coaster supports is definitely one of the top ranked dirty jobs here. It's pretty hard work. But at the same time, I was really glad to just put up some podcasts and some music and try and get my mind on other things and just brainlessly put some wooden posts in this game. So in a sense, it's also kind of therapeutic, because it's just such a brainless activity that you can just relax and do something else also in the meantime. But yeah, with that, I have to say we've actually reached the end of this time lapse, so wow, I'm kind of impressed that I managed to get it this far. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little 2-part mini-series about making a wooden coaster in Planet Coaster. If you want to see the rest of the Uzuri Gardens series, I highly recommend it. It's a really cool park with some really beautiful scenery. And also, if you're curious to see what else will become of this coaster, which I know I am, because I have no idea, you should definitely follow the rest of the series as well, just like in the last episode. I'll link it down in the description. For now, enjoy the cinematic videos that I'll be including here, and the POV at last. And I hope to see you guys next time in another Planet Coaster video where I'm hopefully not placing wooden posts for the whole episode. Bye guys!